public line is not active.
Public line is not active.
It's active.
It is. You're opening this to make it so I can still everything. Last time I poured coffee, my fucking page was black. I usually do red.
Okay.
Oh, the group judge might need to cover. Right? Yes.
All rise.
Good morning, everyone. Please be seated. It'll be a moment before we begin. All right, looks like we're ready to go. Good morning, everyone. We're convened for oral arguments for IPR 2025-00339, challenging the patentability of numerous claims of patent number 7916180. Just to give you a roadmap for the day today, I know we have a hearing for IPR 2025-00342. We will take a break after the hearing today for the 339 case, and then we will proceed with a separate hearing for the 342 case. I'm Judge Strosh, and joining me for this hearing remotely are Judge Laney and Judge Daniels. We'll get started with appearances for the parties. for those that are arguing today. And if anyone else is attending, I see we have some extra folks in the back. Please identify them as well. Counsel for Petitioner, will you please make your appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. My name is Jonathan Bowser. I'm the counsel for petitioner. With me is Hong Shi. Scott Jarrett is also counsel for petitioner, and Paul Margulies is with Tesla.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Counsel for patent owner?
Brandon Thies, lead counsel for patent owner, being assisted today by Ms. Heather King.
Okay, thank you. All right. Following the hearing, please make sure that the court reporter has accurate spellings of your names, as well as any other terms or references or case citations that will be discussed today. Per the order regarding the oral hearing, petitioner has 60 minutes for his presentation. Petitioner will make his presentation first and may reserve some of its time for rebuttal. That time for rebuttal may not exceed 30 minutes. Following petitioner's initial presentation, patent owner will make its presentation, and patent owner will have 60 minutes and may reserve some of its time for rebuttal, and that time shall not exceed 30 minutes as well. A few quick reminders before we begin. To aid in the preparation of the hearing transcript, please identify your demonstrative slides by the slide numbers. It also helps the judges follow along while you're making your presentation. Please remember that your arguments should be limited only to those that have been previously presented in your briefs. And please make sure that you make it clear which challenges and claims you're addressing at all times. And if either of the parties have any objections to opposing counsel's arguments, please wait until it's your time at the podium to note any objections. Counsel for petitioner, would you like to reserve some of your time for rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. I would like to reserve 15 minutes.
And counsel for patent owner, would you like to reserve any time for a rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor, 20 minutes. I also have a quick housekeeping question, whether or not Judge Daniels and Judge Laney will be able to see the screen or not.
Judge Daniels and Judge Laney, would you answer if you are able to see the screen, the slides right now?
So we have, as always, we have a screen with the parties' demonstratives up on them. But if you're showing them, yes, now I can see it. I can see it there as well. But I also have a separate screen with them up.
Understood, Your Honor. But if we were to move our cursor or show a different document, you would be seeing that in real time as you were in the courtroom?
We would if it's showing just like you have it now. Yes.
Thank you. Is that true for you as well, Judge Laney?
It is.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to maintain a clock that's on the wall behind me, and there are green, yellow, and red lights that should provide a warning of when you're getting close to your time being up. All right. Counsel for petitioner, you may begin your presentation when you are ready.
Your Honors, may it please the board. My name is Jonathan Bowser, and I'm counsel for petitioner. I want to start with slide 2, and I want to give you a general overview of the 180 patent. The 180 patent is directed to a digital camera. And here on slide 2, we see figure 4 of the 180 patent. This is what the parties have been focused on. I provided some color annotations just to help illustrate the components. In green, we see 4 optics components. Those are lenses. And in red, there's 4 sensor portions. And there's a one-to-one correspondence. And there we have also, because there's a one-to-one correspondence, there are 4 channels. And this will become apparent when we talk about Claim 22. These are the components that are here. Each channel, and it's described in the 180 patent, has a different field of view. Field of view has 2 things. It's sort of the angular width and also the focal length, how far the camera is away from the particular object. So using that background, I want to describe digital cameras and how they operate in general. And I'm going to use the 180 patent, figure 4 of the 180 patent, kind of, as the background. All right. So what happens is you have light goes through the optics components. So we're going to look at optics component 290A, the one on the upper left, and the light travels in the channel to the sensor portion 292A, right? So what happens in the sensor is that there are millions of pixels. Pixels stands for a picture element. And in those pixels, there's a conversion. So there's a conversion of the light, the photons in the light, to electrons into an electronic signal. That electronic signal represents the exposure of light on that particular pixel. Now, as we can see in the bottom of slide 2, this is from the 180 patent, column 17, lines 29 to 34. The 180 patent very clearly says that those pixels have to be read out, okay? In order to have an image frame, we are talking again about a digital camera. In order to have an image frame, you need 2 parts. You need the first part, which is the exposure period. And then secondly, you need the readout. Now, as we can see in that portion of column 17, it says after being exposed to light for a certain period of time, which is exposure time, the pixels are read out. And typically what happens is they're read out on a sequential line by line basis, kind of like the way that you would read words on a page. You start from left to right, you read the words, you read the pixels. Every pixel is read out. And that's important to keep in mind. So in order to have an image frame, you have to have both the exposure period and you have to have the readout period. If you don't read out the data, you won't have an image frame. So I'll use an analogy here to help illustrate this. Let's say we're trying to measure the amount of rainfall. The first part of that is I go outside, I put a bucket. The bucket collects the rainfall. In that bucket, you are accumulating charges. That's similar to how you're accumulating charges. We're collecting the rain. In the sensor, we're collecting the charges. But you have to read them out. And that readout process is important because when you read out the signals from the pixels, it's in the form of analog data. Analog data then has to be converted to digital. And I'm simplifying this, but it's important because if you don't read out the data, you won't have an image. I want to move to, before I do that, for setting purposes, I'm going to talk about some terms and to keep this, so everybody can kind of help keep this in mind. So I use the word exposure period, that's the period of time that the sensors are exposed. It's the same thing as an exposure time. Intellectual Ventures, or IV, has called it an exposure interval. That means the same thing. You'll also hear terms like integration time. Integration time is the same thing. In paragraph 55 of Mr. Gudash's declaration, he makes this correspondence. When we talk about integration, we're talking about charges accumulating in the sensor. Okay, and you're also going to hear the word accumulation time. That's how Matsushima, one of the references, describes it. Same thing. They all mean the same term. So moving to slide 3, Your Honors, we can see the correspondence of claims.
Before you go there, I just want to make sure I understand the point you just made. Your contention is that a frame does not exist until it's read out of the sensors. So in other words, you're saying the sensors themselves cannot capture a frame.
So the frame yes, to be clear, a frame, the word frame, it's an image. And in order to get an image, you need both the exposure period and you need the readout. If you don't read
why doesn't the sensor have the image? And then we're processing. In other words, if I take your logic to the full extreme, I don't really have an image until it's projected on my monitor or projected on some screen. I guess at what point, I mean, in order to support what you're saying, it seems like you have a frame when the sensors have collected the amount of energy that the processor establishes for that particular pixel that's going to collect during that particular period of time. Now, yes, you have to read all that out in order to process it, in order to make it fit to project onto a screen. I understand there's all those different steps that have to occur before it's something that can be seen, but that's what I'm trying to understand. But doesn't the frame exist after all the sensors have collected the photons that they in fact are going to collect for that particular sensor and totally for the full amount of time that all the sensors are going to collect the energy?
So the frame process has two parts, right? What you're referring to, Your Honor, is the accumulation phase, when you're accumulating the electrons in the sensor. But if you don't read them out, you don't have an image frame. But to your point, you're talking about
Well,
post-process. Sorry.
I guess I'm just, why don't you have an image frame? In other words, if I take those sensors, I mean, it sounds like a chicken and the egg argument. I have an image frame. I just haven't read them out yet.
Well, you can see, Your Honor, you don't really have an image frame yet, because the image frame is the accumulation of the data for all the pixels. You have to read out all the pixels. Okay, so in the semiconductor substrate, which is the sensor, it is just a collection of charges. It is a collection of electrons. That's all you really have. Okay,
And
in
in this particular case, it's a bunch of individual ones. And so you're saying, look, a frame is all of the pixels, and each little sensor is just but one pixel of the frame. And so until you read it out and have all the pixels having all the charges that particular pixel is going to have, until you have that accumulation or that full amount of all those, you don't actually have the frame. Is that?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I want to move to slide 3 just so we can show the general correspondence, so we're all on the same page here. And I've used the same annotations. So I'm focusing on claim 22 because the parties have spent the overwhelming majority of the briefing on claim 22. But we can see in claim 22, which is the method, there's these optics components, which I've highlighted in green, the sensor portions, the sensors in red, and we've got the channels. Moving to slide 4, Your Honors, I want to focus on the only limitation that's in dispute. And just to be clear, there are 2 independent claims at issue in this particular proceeding, claims 1 and 22. Again, the parties have spent the overwhelming amount of time on claim 22. Limitation 22.3 is the only limitation that's in dispute between the parties. And I just want to also mention that limitation 1.2.2 of claim 1 does not have the term during a frame. So moving to slide 5, these are the grounds, and I just want to make clear that in the petition, we've shown that claims 22 and 1 are unpatentable 2 different ways: Matsushima alone and Matsushima in view of you. And we've also shown that claim 22 is unpatentable in ground 3 under the Choi-Lebezowitz and you ground. So on slide 6, this is really what I believe is to be the crystallization of the issue here for ground 1. Okay, and I want to start actually at the bottom of this slide, just to kind of give you some context here. So the top of the slide talks about claim construction, but I just want to make abundantly clear, Your Honors, that petitioner has shown that the claims are unpatentable over petitioner's construction and IB's construction. The reason that I'm focusing on the claim construction issue is because IB's patentability arguments depend entirely, I mean entirely, on their incorrect claim construction. So if you reject IB's claim construction, they have no arguments in favor of the patentability of their claims. So at a very high level, what I want to talk about is what the claim construction dispute is, and it's about during a frame. What does that mean? And IB's construction, in a real nutshell, is they want you to consider only the exposure interval, only the exposure period. They don't want you to consider anything that happens in the readout period. I want to move to slide 8, and here we have the parties' constructions. Put this slide here so Your Honors can see both parties' constructions side by side. So petitioner's construction is during a frame is during a period of time when data for an image is acquired. We've been consistent all throughout. You can see that on page 7 of the petition. IB's construction is something different. They're saying at some point between the beginning and the end of the exposure interval. So again, we're focusing on this finite period, the exposure interval, only that, during which an image sensor captures a single image. So moving to slide 9, Your Honors, there's two main reasons why we have construed this particular term. And the first is to kind of clear up an internal inconsistency in the 180 patent. And what I mean by that is the fact that the word frame is specifically defined in the 180 patent as a physical component. So you think of the housing of the camera, but that's not the way it's used in Claim 22. So we are using we provided a construction to kind of clear up that ambiguity. And during a frame, we can see the way that limitation 22.3 and how it's used in context. Independently controlling simultaneous data acquisition with each of the first and second channels during a frame. So during a frame is imposing a temporal requirement for data acquisition. That's what during a frame refers to. During, it connotes a period of time. And what are we referring to? We're referring to the image frame. So moving to slide 10, I pointed out here why petitioner's construction is supported first by just the claim language itself. We can see—
Mr. Bowser?
Yes.
This is Judge Daniels. When you say a period of time when data for an image frame is acquired, is that including both the exposure period and the readout period?
Yes, Your Honor. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. That includes both, right? And I just want to make clear too, to answer your question, yes, it includes both, because that's how an image frame is acquired. You have to have the exposure interval and you have to have the readout. So during that period of time, you have both the exposure interval and you have the readout period.
But I guess the one thing that I'm struggling with a little bit is, but the readout is not data acquisition, is it? I mean, that's processing the data that you've acquired. And the claim in its context during a frame is specific about data acquisition. And it seems as though even the way you described in our earlier discussion, the acquisition is the point in which the charges are being accumulated onto the sensor. That's the acquisition of data. Now, after you've acquired the data, as you told me before, you have to then collect that data. But you're not acquiring it anymore. You're just processing it at this point. You're processing it so that you can put all the pixels into where the pixels belong and do the, change it from analog to digital and do this further stuff. But all that additional processing is stuff you're doing to the data that you've acquired. And so why doesn't the fact that in the context of the claim in which it says data acquisition during a frame, why doesn't that data acquisition mean, as suggested by patent owner, that it's during that period of time at which those sensors are collecting photons in order to collect or acquire data?
So, Your Honor, the answer to that is the fact that the data acquisition process includes multiple parts. You have the electrical charges, okay? That's not just the data.
Well, let me take your example that you gave me before. You put that bucket out in the rain. That's your data acquisition. You're trying to collect data. How much rain am I collecting? Everything after that, sure, is what you do to make sense of the data that you've acquired, but you're not collecting any more data. You've already collected all the data you're going to collect. You're going to process that data, but you're not acquiring it in your hypo.
So
it seems like what you're trying to then say is, no, I put the bucket out there, I collect the rain. Now when I'm doing all my calculations determine exactly how much rain over what period of time, that's data collection as well. Well, I don't know that I see it that way. It seems like that's how you're making sense of the data you collected, but you're no longer collecting.
So, Your Honor, the data acquisition process is not just the collection of the charges. Okay, you have to use the analogy that we have the rain bucket, each charge is effectively one drop of water, right? I have to then, because one drop of water doesn't tell me anything, just like one charge doesn't tell me anything. I need to read out all the pixels on that sensor. Okay, that includes part of the processing that you're talking about, Your Honor, because I have to accumulate all that data. That is what we talk about data acquisition. I'm acquiring the data for the image frame. I'm not acquiring.
Okay, well, and that's fine. So I guess, again, staying with the hypothetical, sure, you put out 100 buckets. And some buckets you let fill for 10 seconds, some buckets you let fill for 100 seconds, some buckets, different. You can have all different times at which those buckets are going to collect rain. But after those, for each one of those buckets, whatever time you've set for that bucket to collect rain, that's the data acquisition. I don't understand how then, I guess where I'm struggling with is once you start processing to put everything together, to me, that's processing the information, the data you've got to make more sense of it. You're not actually collecting or acquiring data anymore.
Well, no, see, Your Honor, I respectfully disagree because the claim says data acquisition during a frame. We don't have a frame until you read it out. This is talking about data acquisition. So we're talking about the entire frame period. Okay, if I can go to slide 12. So what, and this is from a 1994.
Just so you understand where I understand what you're saying. I accept for you that a frame process is both the collection of the data and the reading out the data, right? Sure, the frame may be a longer period of time, which is why the claim has to call out during the frame. It's saying data acquisition. Now it's telling me, okay, at what point am I looking at this data acquisition? Well, it's during the frame. Yes, that frame could be a longer period of time, but the data acquisition is a particular period within the frame. Why isn't that the appropriate understanding of the claim language?
Because you're talking only about the exposure period, right? You're talking about when charges accumulated. That is not the whole frame process. And I will show you the frame period. Let me go to slide 12. I think this will help clear this up. The word frame period during a frame, that's what we're talking about. It includes a readout. This is a well-known concept. What does a frame mean? A frame means a readout. You don't have a frame unless you have a readout. So when you're acquiring data, you're talking about now. Let me go back to slide.
But I guess where I don't feel like you're directly addressing. I don't know that I'm quibbling so much with you about during the frame, as much as what I'm saying is the data acquisition during the frame doesn't extend to. I guess maybe I'm getting confused. I don't believe, or I'm not following the argument that readout is part of data acquisition. Data acquisition is, because each one of these sensors are independent. You agree, right? As far as the claims, and each one is its own independent entity.
That's correct.
And so while you're correct that the frame makes sense, sure, maybe each one of these pixels or these entities isn't very useful until you put it all together, but each one is its own independent thing. And so when you're collecting data for this one pixel, I just don't see how that is anything after you've collected the photon is data acquisition.
So, Your Honor,
Mr. Bowser, let me just follow up to make sure I understand. So I was looking at your, I don't know if this is helpful to the discussion. I was looking at slide 11, and I was looking at the excerpt from the patent, which is exhibit 1001 that you have cut out here, in lines 19 through 24. And what it's talking about here is the data from all centers can be digitally combined to provide much greater dynamic range as within one frame of the digital camera data. So you were explaining before that the readout includes changing the analog data to digital. And that seems to be, is what you said there consistent with this, where it's saying that the raw digital camera data is now stored and displayed, and that's the digital data is what we're talking about when we talk about a frame in this paragraph.
Yes, Your Honor. So the process starts. Okay, so let me just to be abundantly clear, and I think this will help clear it up if you look at paragraphs 24 to 55 of Mr. Gudash's declaration. He explains how all this works in the technology background. You first have the electrons. Those electrons are then converted into a voltage. That voltage is then converted and sometimes processed further. And for example, you might clean up some noise, you might amplify it, and then that is then converted into digital data. The data acquisition process is from the point that you accumulate the electrons all the way until you get to the digital data. And we see that on slide 11. The point is, the limitation 22.4 makes it very clear. We're talking about the data received during the frame. Data received during the frame, and that is what's combined. It is not just one snapshot in time. And I should also say, too, that Your Honors, data acquisition does not say acquiring the electrons or acquiring the photoelectrons. It says data acquisition during a frame. So during the entire frame process, that's what data we're referring to. I want to move, also, for your reference, on page 16 of the patent owner response, even patent owner says that a frame is digital data. So let me move to slide 13. Also, why there is the readout period, okay? IV's own evidence, and just for context here, IV was arguing that the rolling mode doesn't have the readout. Well, their own evidence shows that frame time, so we're talking about a period of time during a frame, their own evidence shows in orange that there's the readout. That is the readout time. It's very clear. This is how the term is used in the art. So I'm going to move to slide 14 quickly. Just this highlights why their construction is wrong. So first off, it excludes the readout period. They are drawing this arbitrary line about the exposure interval during which an image sensor captures a single image. Well, again, we don't have an image during the exposure interval. All we have are accumulated charges. So their construction doesn't make sense. Let me go to the fact that the 180 patent itself, I'm on slide 15, makes very clear after being exposed to light for a certain period of time, the pixels are read out. We talked about this before. That is an imperative part of the image frame process. You acquire data, which includes...
One second, if you don't mind. Define for me the exact point in which you have an image.
In the context of a digital camera, Your Honor, you have an image when you have a digital representation of that image.
So when it's projected onto my screen?
No, it doesn't have to be projected. It's just at some point, so basically you have an image after you've converted all the analog information to digital. Then you have an image. All right?
Wait, so as soon as you converted all of it to digital, you now have an image. All the other processing that goes into making it the image that'll be projected is not included. So why is that? I guess to me that seems more arbitrary than in the context of this claim. That again, if I'm looking at this claim language in the context of the claim, which is very specific about talking about the independence of these independent of these sensors. So if I'm looking at the claim is talking about the optic components. It's talking about the channels to the sensors. I mean, we are talking at the level of the sensors and the optics. And now you're wanting to go beyond that. But then you're telling me that patent owners being arbitrary by saying we're just looking at the accumulation of photons when it's actually when the image is created. But to me, from reading all this stuff, it seems like the image isn't created till a long time later. And it seems as though you're happy, petitioner's happy with us construing it to be long enough to cover what they want to cover. But you're not really clear to me about why it is I define the image at that point any more so than at where patent owner defines it. Unless what you're telling me is what I hear you saying today is, okay, the time frame stops at reading out at readout. So once you have, so the time period would be from the point at which the light is allowed through the channels, and then as soon as that information is read out, that's the period.
So yes, and I want to be clear too, just before I answer your question, I want to be clear that, and I will show this later, that we've shown why the claims are unpatentable even under IV's construction. So we were spending a lot of time on what during a frame means. But let me point out too that, Your Honor, you're interpreting the claim as being somehow limited to just what happens in the first and second channels. Nowhere in the claim does it say that. It doesn't say only in the channels. It just says there's data acquisition with each of the channels. The channels are part of the data acquisition process. Let me go to slide 16.
That's fair. What it says is independently controlling simultaneous data acquisition with each of the first and second channels. I mean, that's what the claim says. I mean, the claim is very specific about the channels and data acquisition during the time frame and in the context of very specific talking about the optic components and the channels with the sensors. I mean, I don't know that that's fair to say that I'm just focusing on that. I think the claim focuses on that.
Well, no, see, Your Honor, let me go to slide 16, and then I'm going to come back to slide 15. So we see Dr. Saber, which is IV's expert, and we asked him, are there any other stages that are part of the data acquisition process? We're talking about data acquisition. Again, this is the same term that's used in the claim. And he says, yes, conversion from analog to digital. You need that. That's part of it. And he also said that you have to collect the data on those CCD arrays. CCD stands for charge coupled device. Those are the arrays. That's the type of sensor that's described in the 180 patent along with Matsushima we're going to talk about. You have to read it out. Otherwise, what's the point of collecting it? And let me go back to slide 15, Your Honor. So we're talking about data acquisition with the channels. Okay? It's not limited to just what happens in the channels between the optics component and the sensor portion. There's still, in order to get an image frame, you have to read it out. Let me go, Your Honors, if I can, to slide. Well, first off, Your Honor, did that answer your question?
It does and it doesn't. What you pointed to me, the question is phrased a little bit interesting, and I'll say it this way. Your question in the part you read says, any other steps of the data acquisition process? I could understand that creating some confusion as it relates to claim construction. We're not talking about data acquisition process. The claim does not say data acquisition process. The claim says during data acquisition. I don't find those to be the same.
Well, again, Your Honor, I think that if you interpret it as being just only what happens in between the optics component and the sensor portions, you're reading limitations that are not required in the claim. The claim just says data acquisition with the channels during a frame. And again, a frame means in order to have a frame, you have to convert that data.
But it doesn't say you have to have a frame. It just says a period of time that's defined by a frame. So even if I were to give you that a frame, if I were to use frame as my time, because it says during a frame, so say let's for simplicity say frame is 1 to 10 seconds. I don't have to do it the whole 1 to 10 seconds. I'm looking at data acquisition that occurs during that 1 to 10 seconds. That 1 to 10 seconds can include all kinds of different things. I'm just looking at data acquisition that occurs during that time period. So while you may be correct that frame defines a larger time period, in the context of the claim, I'm looking at data acquisition that would occur during that larger period of time. So data acquisition could be a shorter period of time than the actual frame.
Okay.
During does not mean the entire time. It just means that within that scope, within that period, sometime within that period, that's when I'm concerned with. But it tells me specifically what I'm concerned with, which is data acquisition.
Right, but you're still acquiring data with the channels during that period. So when it says with each of the channels, it doesn't mean that the data acquisition is simply limited to the only thing that happens between the optics component and the sensors. Now, I will explain too, even under IV's construction, I want to just kind of cut to the chase here a little bit. I'm going to skip over some things, but I want to talk
Mr.
about.
Bowser, let me just go back a second and ask what supports your position here. You're saying is that when you deposed Dr. Saber and you asked him what other steps are in the data, he said that it includes conversion from analog to digital. Is that correct?
That's right. And I would also make clear.
Followed up.
Sorry.
But what
Sorry.
he said, he didn't say
And
that
then
about data acquisition. He said that the whole process includes conversion.
Okay. I would also just point you to Mr. Gudash's supplemental declaration, where he says that the data acquisition includes the readout period. This is uncontested expert testimony that we have. IV did not depose Mr. Gudash, did not try to get at this. All you have really is attorney argument. Let me, if I can, in the remaining time, I want to just kind of briefly cover why Matsushima discloses this. So I'm going to jump around here a little bit just because I only have 10 minutes remaining. But what we have in Matsushima is we have this dual channel system. Okay, and I'm first going to show you the images. It's the result, and that'll help explain what's exactly going on. You have two images. And the one in the image in the top is the wide angle view, and the one on the bottom, it's the same subject at the same time, because we know that from Matsushima because it says it's the scaled up image. So you have two images of the same scene at the same time that are acquired. Now, what we can see I'm on slide 19 now. Matsushima discloses two independent imaging systems, and this is how Matsushima achieves this. The subject images, if you kind of squint a little bit, sensors 18A in red and sensor 18B in green. Those are the sensors, CCD sensors. That is what is accumulating the charge. After that, you have the correlated double sampling circuit, 22A. That is processing the analog signal. Then you have the analog to digital conversion. Then it goes into the memory, okay? 24A is analog to digital. The point here is that each one of these circuits is driven synchronously. Synchronously means at the same time, simultaneous. And it's during the frame because this is the period where we're trying to acquire the image. Again, what does during a frame means? It means during a period of time when an image frame is acquired. So I want to move to slide 20, and this just really illustrates why there's simultaneous data acquisition during a frame. We see in figure 7 is the method that's carried out by the CPU in Matsushima's digital camera. You acquire the two images after the release button is fully pressed. If you've ever used a DSLR camera or something like that, what they're talking about here is that when you half press it, you're kind of priming the camera. You're determining what the light settings are. But when you fully press it, when you fully press that camera, you obtain these images simultaneously of the same scene at the same time. Just to tie this together, in slide 21, we have the images and the structure. Again, Matsushima is capturing images at the same time. So I want to show you, I want to next turn to why Matsushima discloses independently controlling, even under IV's incorrect claim construction, that during a frame has to be limited to only the exposure interval. But just for context, and now I'm on slide 27, Your Honors. Again, we're talking about the independent imaging systems. They're formed on the light receiving surfaces. We talked about this. So I want to, if I can, sorry, I need to explain something. I'm jumping around here a little bit too much. On slide 19, if Your Honors can go to please slide 19. I covered. Sorry, I did cover this. I want to cover, but just make this clear that we have the timing signal generating circuit in paragraph 27, and the CPU. Those two components drive the imaging system in red, and they drive the imaging system in green. They drive them synchronously at the same time. And the reason I'm explaining that is because I'm
Can I ask
referring.
you on that point real quick? If you have a single signal that's driving everything, can that still be independent?
Well, yes, Your Honor, and I'm going to explain why here real quick.
Yeah.
Okay, so for context, this is IV's argument that we don't have independently controlling during the exposure interval. They theorize that this independent control could occur after the exposure interval. And I'm going to explain why that's not correct. Okay, so we have to get in the weeds here a little bit, and I apologize for this, but we have to understand how the sensors operate. So in paragraph 24, this is really important, and I really need to stress this. So the CCD 18A and CCD 18B, those are controlled via a shutter drain, okay, and a shutter gate. And you have these shutter gate pulses. Just like the sensor portions we talked about in the 180 patent that accumulate the charges, these sensor portions, these CCDs, the sensors, 18A and 18B, they are accumulating the charges. These are controlled. They're controlling the accumulation time. Again, we're controlling the integration time or the exposure time of the charge that's accumulated. We have specific control by each sensor. Matsushima is very clear. Each sensor is controlled via shutter gate pulses. You have independent control. How do we know this? Let's look at slide 30. So slide 30, again, for context here, I want to just say that this diagram is in the background. Well, the diagram without the red annotation. This diagram is in the background description of the technology background of Mr. Gudash's declaration, where he's describing how sensors accumulate charges with gate pulses, and that's how they operate. So you have, in slide 30, you've got two controls. You have the disable signal, right? The disable signal is controlling the gate. When the gate is off, when the disable signal is low, the sensor is accumulating charges. So Judge Laney, if you're going to look at data acquisition as being only the electron charges, we have that. We have that in Matsushima. We have the sensors 18A and 18B are each independently controlled. And we also have, importantly, I want to just stress this too, we have a second control. We have the transfer. You see the second line. The transfer is when the charges, the accumulated charges, the acquired data is
When you say the second line, which one are you referring to again?
the
The second
transfer line. Transfer line. The second line, so the first line is the disable. So in the first line, the disable line, that is controlling the gate. And when it's off, you're accumulating charges. So charges are accumulating. We're filling the sensor effectively, to kind of really make this very broad. And then you have to release those charges. So you transfer those. That's in step 2. Integration step, the integration time, we are controlling the sensors. You are independently controlling. So if you were to consider the data acquisition part as being only during what's happening between the optics component and the sensor, U clearly teaches that. Sorry, not you. I apologize. Matsushima teaches that. I want to also go to slide 31. Matsushima also discloses independent control in the readout period. We see paragraph 25, we covered that, where the signals that are retrieved from the sensors, 18A and 18B, they're processed. So paragraph 25 is talking about the analog processing. This is still part of the data acquisition because we want to acquire data for an image. Paragraph 26, that refers to the AD converters, analog to digital. That's part of the process. So just to tie this all together, under both constructions, where petitioner's construction, which during a frame means the exposure interval, well, we don't actually say exposure interval, but effectively the claim, we're saying that during a period of time in which an image frame is acquired, that would include both the exposure interval and the readout period. Matsushima discloses independent controlling during both those periods. The exposure interval, look at paragraph 24. If you just limit it to exposure interval, we have controlling the accumulation time. We are controlling the charges that are received in the sensor, that are accumulated. That is independent control of the sensors. We also have control during the readout period. Matsushima is very clear in this. Next, in the interest of time, I want to just cover real quick the ground 3. So ground 3 is Choi, Lebezowitz, and Yu, and patent owners' really only argument is they argue that Lebezowitz is not prior art. And what they're arguing, and I'm on slide 38, I have just sort of a summary of what their arguments are. So in the petition, we showed that the 854 provisional, which is the earliest provisional in the priority chain, the 180 patent claims priority to 3 provisionals, and we're only referring to the earliest one. It doesn't have 2 features that are recited in the claims. First off, it doesn't have multiple sensors. And this particular argument, or this particular deficiency, relates only to claim 22. It also doesn't have multiple channels having different fields of view. That is not contained in the 854 provisional. And so I want to cover this because IV's arguments really depend on whether Lebezowitz is prior art. And I know I'm going into my rebuttal time, and I'll be quick here. So first off, let's look at figure 3, the provisional. We see there's an image sensor, a single image sensor. That image sensor, 210, it includes a semiconductor chip having multiple arrays. So I would suggest that your honors also go to the 180 patent and starting in column 21, and you'll see definitions for arrays, and you'll see definition for image sensor, okay? And the main difference, and by the way, these same definitions are in the 854 provisional, verbatim, identical. The main difference is that an array does not include the signal processing circuitry. An image sensor, however, is defined to include the signal processing circuitry. We asked, sorry, I'm on slide 40 now. The single sensor doesn't provide support for the claimed multiple sensors. We have two image sensors very clearly recited in Claim 22. We've identified them in red and in blue. The 854 provisional has one sensor only. It has an array, but again, an array is different than an image sensor. Going to slide 41. We asked Dr. Saber. So for context here, we put up 180 patent figure 7, which looks a lot like figure 3 of the 854 provisional. We asked him, does figure 7 provide support for Claim 22? And he said, no. For you to practice Claim 22, you would need to have a first image sensor and a second image sensor. So the last point I want to touch on is with respect to whether or not the provisional provides support for multiple channels having different fields of view. And what IV has said is that, well, we have different focal lengths. Therefore, it inherently discloses different fields of view. But that's inconsistent with how the field of view is. So we have Mr. Gudash. His explanation is referring to 1040, that a field of view requires two things. It requires a focal length, which is the distance between the sensor and the image, and it also has the sensor size. Those two variables are what defines a field of view. So IV's argument that somehow just having different focal lengths necessarily results in a different field of view, that is incorrect. And in fact, their own patent contradicts themselves. Look in paragraph 95 of Mr. Gudash's supplemental declaration, where he quotes the 180 patent, and it's very clear. It says the combination of the focal plane or image sensor size, so that's K, the blue in the diagram above, along with the optical focal length, gives you the desired field of view. You need both. And with that, I will reserve the remaining time for my rebuttals. Thank you.
Technology is great when it works. Are your honors ready to proceed? Brandon Thies for the patent owner Intellectual Ventures. Mr. Bowser and I agree on a great many things related to this patent, but there's some things we fundamentally disagree on. I would like to start with slide 13 of petitioner's demonstratives. There was a spirited discussion about this slide. On this slide, petitioner has excerpted from our reply brief a discussion of the acquisition time and the frame time. During the discussion with Mr. Bowser, there was an analogy related to a bucket collecting rain. Patent owner's position is entirely what you were asking, Mr. Judge Laney, is that the collection time is the integration time that is referred to in the patent. So that is the time you are collecting the data. That is the time when the bucket is open. Mr. Bowser's analogy omitted one thing, is that there's a difference between exposure time and the entire data collection period, because the bucket can have a lid in an optical system. You can have a lens, a physical aperture that covers it. So there's the period of time the cover is off, the aperture is open. Then there is the period of time when the bucket is open collecting the raindrops. That on slide 13 of petitioner's demonstratives is illustrated in blue. The period of data collection stops when the rain is collected, when the electrons are collected. The integration time specifically is different than the exposure time because the exposure time has that when I open the bucket concept. But we are specifically talking about the time when the bucket is open receiving the rain, using Mr. Bowser's analogy, which is shown in the blue boxes shown there. At the end of the blue box is the end of the acquisition period. I also want to go to slide, sorry. No, Your Honor. I just was saying that the claim
Could
covers
you repeat
that
the
all the
question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear Judge Gross's question. Can you turn on your microphone?
Sorry. I asked if counsel was trying to say that the claim language covers the exposure time but does not cover the integration time.
I think you would ask it slightly differently
Oh,
before,
okay.
but I understand the question, and the answer sort of is the same. No, Your Honor, to make it crystal clear, the acquisition time is from the time period when the photons start entering into the camera to the time they're collected. That is what the claim language is talking about as the acquisition period, the time when the photons are being collected.
And that does the time that the photons are collected, does that include the integration time or not?
It absolutely does, because the
Okay.
integration time is how long you're keeping that bucket open.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes,
I'm
Judge
thinking
Laney-
mathematically. That's why I'm
Yeah,
asking.
yeah.
about-
Judge Laney had said, had given an example of 10, 30 seconds, 100 seconds, and you're collecting the rain being collected. Each one of those 10, 30, 100 seconds would represent the integration time.
Okay.
Mr. Bowser's analogy didn't really get the exposure concept where you had the bucket, you had a cover over the bucket for a period of time, which is sort of irrelevant because we only really care about the time when the bucket is open collecting the data. That was just a finer point. And this is consistent with slide 16 of the demonstratives, of petitioner's demonstratives, particularly the end highlighted section. So obviously, when you collect the data on the CCD arrays, you have to read it out. Otherwise, what's the point of collecting it? We've collected the data. Collected and acquired are synonyms. I can't find a real difference that anyone would find between the word collected and acquired. And Judge Laney, you're absolutely correct. The question here is about the process, not data acquisition. So once you've collected the data, yeah, you absolutely can further process it, but you already have it. You've collected it. And that's what's critical in this claim, is that the claim language itself doesn't say capturing an image. It says controlling the acquisition. And that's
Counsel, let me ask this. So the sensor catches, it gets a charge by having these photons on it. And that's when that's the integration time, and that's the aperture. That's the aperture being open, and that's the collection time. And you're saying that those photons are now the data, the acquired data.
Absolutely, Your Honor. Yes, 100%.
Is that-
Yes. With the one finite thing,
Okay.
the integration time is just how long you're counting those number of photons. Yes.
Right. I get the argument. Here's my question. I guess, and it goes to this or the analogy. If I'm looking at a bucket of water or a sensor full of photons, how do I know what I have? I have a bucket of water. I have a sensor with charges on it. Until I do something with it, how is that data? It's stuff, it's photons, it's a bucket of water, but until I count the water molecules, until I count how much water has fallen in there by inches or centimeters, or I count the photons, how is just having a bucket of photons or a bucket of water data?
Very easily, Your Honor, and I apologize that the best way I can answer your question is via analogy. I have a friend who is a researcher who studies marine ecology. She will go out on these long expeditions and collect samples. She will collect the data of the water. After 3 months on the water, she will go back to her lab and then process the data she has collected. No one would say that the data collection period is when she first puts the bucket in the water and then it sits on the shelf for 3 months. And then months later, one of her grad students spins it up in a centrifuge and sees what microbes are hanging out in there, is the data collection period. Everyone would understand that the data collection period is the time period when she has the bucket in the water.
Yeah, that's one thing I think highlights a question I'm having. I mean, we have to stay with what the claim language says, and it says controlling, I'm going to paraphrase, or it says controlling acquisition. We're talking about control of the process of getting the data. I don't know why we're focusing on collecting, I mean, of what you do with the information after you've collected it to make sense of it, because it seems like the claim is about the process you're used in order to get the information you're later going to make sense of.
Judge Laney, I honestly could not have said it better myself. Patent owner 100% agrees with what you just said, and you were able to say it without resorting to an analogy. Yes, we are talking about controlling the specific parameters of how the data is collected, specifically modifying things like the exposure time, integration time, that affect fundamentally what data is collected. Not the downstream processing, not anything that happens after it. It's fundamentally changing how the photons are coming in, how long we're looking at that period of time to see if a photon or how many photons hit the sensor. That's fundamentally what we are talking about here, and that is captured in the specification itself. If I can show my slide, just give me 1 second to project my slides. I'm going to patent owner's slide 8, where we're excerpting from the application. The 4 camera channels can be operated simultaneously with independent electrical control of features such as integration time and frame rate in the video application, to name a few. So, Your Honors, there is a fundamental distinction that Judge Laney has correctly stated, is we're controlling how the photons are collected. That is what the claim is recited to. That is a component informing the image that's not really in dispute. What is in dispute is how we are collecting the data that ultimately is synthesized into the image.
And to use the analogy used before, if you had 100 buckets out there, you have to have, if you have 100 buckets, you have to have 100 lids, because you have to be able to put one lid on after 10 seconds, another lid on after 100 seconds, another lid on after 50 seconds, so you can control how much rain you're going to collect in each bucket.
Absolutely, Your Honor. Yes, that would be one way of doing it, or you could send out a grad student out there after 100 seconds and go grab it. Yes, absolutely. You can control it by using the lid, which would be analogous to controlling the aperture, the physical aperture, closing the shutter. Or you could do more of something that's more analogous to the integration time, which would be go send out your grad student after 100 seconds to go collect the bucket. Both would be a manner of changing how the data was collected. It wouldn't speak to how you measured it after it was collected, but that data is already in the bucket. It's got its lid on. It's not going to change. And that is what the claim fundamentally is about. It's about the acquisition of those photons. Once the photons are acquired, the acquisition period is over. So, Your Honors, I'd like to talk about the during a frame limitation, specifically looking at patent owner slide 10. We are actually in very much agreement with what the during a frame represents. Again, as petitioner stood up here and showed an excerpt from our reply brief on their slide 13, we agree. What is critical is while that image is being formed, an image and frame are inextricably linked. You have to be controlling, you have to be doing something. You have to be sending out your grad student to go collect the bucket while you're collecting the data. And this ties very closely into the idea of a rolling shutter. Now, Mr. Bowser made an analogy to words on a page, and the rolling shutter is actually an interesting concept. In the concept of a rolling shutter, using Mr. Bowser's analogy, you are writing and reading at the same time. You're actually overwriting what you've previously read. And what that allows you to do is you're reading offline the top of the line while you're writing to the bottom line, and you're moving around in sort of a circular fashion. That allows you to do something very cool, is you can change the integration time dynamically. So the integration time of the top row can be completely different than the integration time of the bottom row. So under everyone's construction here of drawing a frame, you have to be able to change the integration time, the exposure time, the aperture controls, something fundamental about the acquisition process while the camera is open and collecting the data. Now, I want to talk about the independent control aspects here. Specifically in the context of the dispute related to what Matsushima teaches. And fundamentally, what Matsushima does, and Your Honors, in our previous patent with related to this, we had a spirited discussion about this. But what Matsushima does is it uses one exposure value for both sensors. And then based on that exposure value, calculations can be done, but it is based on one single value. That is not independent control. So counsel, Mr. Bowser and I, as I said, we agree on a great many things. One of the things we fundamentally do not agree on is whether the mere fact that things are synchronous means they're happening simultaneously. Your Honor, those words are very different. Synchronous just means they're running on the same clock. You very easily can have a synchronous system running on the same clock where something is triggered on the rising edge of the clock and something is triggered on the falling edge of the clock. That would be an example of a synchronous system that would never happen simultaneously because one's being triggered on the upswing, one's being triggered on the downswing. Similarly, Your Honors, you can have a clock system that is synchronous where one is running on every clock and one is running on every 10th clock or 7th clock. There is nothing fundamental about having a synchronous system that requires simultaneously. Synchronous and simultaneously fundamentally are not the same. They just aren't. And when we look at what Matsushima...
Are you suggesting that a skilled artisan wouldn't at least understand Matsuyama to suggest that the sensors are simultaneously acquiring data and that the controller's not independently controlling each of the sensors?
Well, Your Honor, I think there was two issues in there. I think there was the independent control aspect of it, and we believe that in Matsushima there is no independent control such that each sensor is actually being controlled. There's one unifying control for both the sensors.
And that's, so let's start there, because I think that's a point of contention for me, because are you suggesting you cannot have independent control? I think I asked petitioner this. Are you saying you don't think you can have independent control even if you use a single signal to control each one independently?
The question, as I understand it, is do I think that you can have a independent control if each one is receiving the same control signal?
Yes.
No, I don't think that's independent control. It's the same control signal.
But each one is still being controlled independently, even if it's using the same control signal. I guess that's where, that's where I struggle a little bit with this, because even if I have, going back to our analogy, let's say I have 100 grad students, and I have a bullhorn, and I say, go get my buckets. And each one of those grad students goes and gets a bucket. To me, that's still, each one of those grad students that's still independent control of those buckets, despite the fact that my control, I used a single signal to have each one of those independently control those buckets?
Your Honor, I think that's a reasonable interpretation. I think under either interpretation, Matsushima doesn't teach what we're talking about as it relates to the patent at issue here. I want to also address the second part of your question regarding the simultaneous aspect in your original question. Is that okay?
For sure, but finish with this first idea. Well, you said, I think that's reasonable, but why is that? Why is it? How's that consistent with the other position you just told me that single signal is not independent control?
Well, because, Your Honor, I believe that the control there is exactly the same. That you're triggering on exactly the same event. Mind you, the grad students might run a little bit faster to each one of the buckets, but what's triggering and what's controlling is the same. Our patent is very specific to the idea that you can have one integration time, one grad student being dispatched at 10 seconds and one grad student being dispatched at 20 seconds. In your hypothetical, that isn't possible because they would all be dispatched at 10 seconds.
And you're saying Matsuyama is limited such that I guess that's where I'm a little bit struggling with patent owner's position is.
Yeah, absolutely, Your Honor. But
Matsuyama discloses a system that allows or to a skilled art would suggest to a skilled artisan that because each one has its own separate independent structures for controlling it, it's independently controlled, even if it's using a CPU and other circuitry to, as you were saying earlier, synchronize it, but a single signal to control. I mean, the fact that you have one signal that controls the independent control, I guess, is how I'm seeing Matsuyama.
Well, I think the simultaneous does some work there as well. I think that a skilled artisan, and I believe Dr. Saber would also agree with our position, is that the independent control here means that the controlling system can provide a different integration time, exposure time, et cetera, to each one of the channels. If it is instructing the same value, the same exposure value to both the channels, that's not independent control. And that's what we see in Matsushima, is that both channels are going to have the same EV value. Related to this.
So yeah, when I'm looking at this, so here's the thing. I've got, in Matsuyama, you've got several different sensors that all have their own structure for controlling when it's the photons, how the photons are collected and the photons being extracted, or controlling the shutter and controlling the receiving from the sensor, or retrieving the data from the sensor. So it has all its independent stuff. It's just you have a single signal that's telling each one of these things to do it, to collect their data. And it happens that they're telling all the sensors, it just so happens that each one of the sensors is going to collect data for 10 seconds.
That's correct, Your Honor.
But it's still independent control, right? So if I send something saying, collect it for 10 seconds, the fact that I'm telling every single one, collect it for 10 seconds, that in of itself doesn't mean that they're not independently controlled. I guess what I hear you saying is, well, until you establish that it's not limited to everyone having to collect data at the same 10 seconds, in other words, one could collect 20, the other could collect 10, then you haven't established that it's independently controlled.
That is patent owner's position, yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
Which I think also relates into this the sequential aspect of what is taught in Matsushima. Matsushima expressly says that, I'll just read from it specifically, that the accumulated signal charges are retrieved by the CCD drive pulses applied by the CCD drive circuits 20A and 20B and are sequentially output from the CCD 18A and 18B as voltage signals. Your Honors, if we're doing things that are simultaneously, meaning occurring at the same time, why would Matsushima then send the data sequentially? Your Honor, that would be analogous to everyone queuing up at the end. So you have 100 grad students, and then everyone queues up at the end, single file, to turn in their samples. That isn't what our patent is entirely about. Our patent is entirely about doing this, particularly in a video application where synchronization is going to be critical, is to have everything happening in parallel. That's why they're independent channels. And Matsushima pulls in exactly the opposite direction by saying that these things have to occur sequentially. And we know the standards in the prior art relating to mosaic systems were that you would take the pictures with a small delta t between the successive images. And that is where a skilled artisan would be driven, is with this teaching in Matsushima that you're going to do it sequentially. You're going to take the pictures sequentially, small time period so that values aren't going to change dramatically. You're going to move it and read it and process it sequentially, because that's what Matsushima says. We talked about the synchronous versus simultaneous. I just need to reiterate this. Simultaneous means occurring at the same time. Moving my right hand and then later moving my left hand is not simultaneous. For it to be simultaneous, I need to be flapping both hands at the same time.
For the record, could you identify the paragraphs from Matsuyama that is it paragraphs 31? Is that what you're relying heavily on?
Yes, it's paragraph 23, specifically as called out on slide 19, which the slide 19 is excerpting from the SIR reply at 11 and 12.
Okay.
I would also like to touch on moving to slide 21. Petitioner is now trying to utilize the additional references that were not part of ground one. Specifically, they're saying that the supplemental declaration says that Pasito would have modified Matsushima's sequential operations with simultaneous ones by Choi and Weldy. Well, Your Honors, Choi and Weldy are not part of ground one. Their teachings are fundamentally irrelevant to this because it was petitioner's burden to lay out in the petition the case for invalidity. Ground one does not include these references. Therefore, Your Honors should not put any weight to anything that is disclosed in Choi or Weldy because it's not the ground before the court today. Moving to slide 23 of patent owner's demonstratives, specifically when we're excerpting the reply at page 6 through 7. In the upper right-hand corner, we are showing an excerpt from the petition at page 9. And it's important, Your Honor, and this is not a matter of box drawing, is that the petitioner in the petition identified specific components as composing the first channel. Notably absent from petitioner's mapping is the CDS. CDS stands for correlated double sampling. So in correlated double sampling, you take the acquired data and then you subtract a reference signal that was acquired beforehand. The reason you do correlated double sampling is to subtract out the noise that's inherent in the system. Some of your CCD detectors might just pick up random noise from the electronic components that are in the camera. So you do CDS after the data is acquired to filter out noisy data that might have accidentally been collected. After the CDS is the A to D. Notably absent from the petition is identifying either the CDS or the A to D as part of the first channel. Petitioner has just stood up here and has relied upon things that are done by these components for their proposed mapping. Petitioner just stood up here and made quite a great deal about the timing diagram that is shown in their expert's report. That was in the technical background section. It doesn't provide any citation to another reference to support this. And Your Honors, I would direct you to Xerox Free Bytemark, where the director afforded very little weight to a situation very similar to this, and in Xerox v. Weitmark, was when the expert opined without any support of an inherent claim limitation. It's not tied to any of the references here. It doesn't connect it to Matsushima. It doesn't provide a textbook. It doesn't provide any other support. It is just his conjecture. And as is held in Xerox v. Weitmark, when an expert opines without support, it is effectively attorney argument, which comports with the Federal Circuit holding in Facebook, which holds exactly the same thing. Mr. Bowser talked about how we're familiar with common digital cameras and how you press a button and then things happen. Well, Your Honors, that is not control. That is not controlling how the individual sensors are working in that. It just is not. We talked quite a bit already about Matsushima teaching a singular exposure signal. Specifically, as we call it in the briefs, and it's called out specifically on slide 27, we have, I'll just read from paragraph 34. For the AE control, the automatic exposure control, the subject luminescence EV value is determined based on the integration of RGB signals in a single frame by integration circuits 60A, 60B, and the aperture value and the shutter speed are determined based on this EV value. Your Honors, it doesn't say the respective aperture value. It doesn't say the respective shutter speed. It doesn't say shutter speed 112A, shutter speed 112B. It just says one value.
But it's giving each one that value.
Absolutely, Your Honor. And that was the issue that we talked about
And
earlier.
that's the part. And so that's, I guess, and maybe I'm looking at it to simplicity at some point, but to me, that seems like the fact that it has to give each one the shutter value, even if it's the same shutter value, it's independent control.
Correct, Your Honor. Let's return to the claim language here, so I can further articulate patent owner's position with regard to that. If we were to adopt your position there, Your Honor, we could just say in the claim language 22, I move back to patent owner slide 2. We could say controlling simultaneous data acquisition with each of the first and second channels storing a frame. That would be very consistent with your grad student explanation where you sound the horn and everyone goes out and runs and grabs the bucket. The term independent has to mean something because it has to, every claim term has a meaning. And
But doesn't it mean, going back to the grad example, doesn't it mean that I have to give each one of my grad students the time, even if it's the same time, I'd have to go to each one of my grad students, say 10 seconds. All right, 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 seconds. I still have to send each one their own independent little message or signal.
Your Honor, what I think is the claim language is instructive here. So it says controlling the simultaneous data acquisition with each of the first and second channels storing a frame. So under the grad student example.
Where did you just read that from?
Slide 2, the claim. I just omitted the word independent. It's a disputed claim element. I was just reading out the word independently.
Okay.
And saying that we have to control both the first and second channel. So the first and second grad student. So if we tell both of those grad students the same thing, 10 seconds, that would meet controlling.
So maybe this is a way to highlight where you can explain that my thinking is wrong. So I take your point with, if you just said control simultaneous data acquisition with each of the plurality of channels, that just requires during the same period of time you're acquiring or within a period of common time, you're acquiring the data for the multi-different channels.
Yes.
And then independently means each one is separately doing it. But it's not just independent, it's independently controlling. So I guess let's flesh it out what I think.
Mhm.
I guess the difference between a bullhorn and a single message to each one of my grad students.
I think that's a great, yes, that captures the analogy perfectly. Yes.
Okay, so in Matsuyama, because each one are separate structures, it's not really using a bullhorn. It's sending a separate a separate message to each one of the structures, each one of the sensors. So why isn't that independent? Why isn't that at least within the scope of what's claimed?
Yes, Your Honor. I believe that it's not sending a separate message. It's sending that same bullhorn, that same, and both grad students are hearing the bullhorn. It would be very different where one grad student was keyed on one sound and one
Yes.
grad student was keyed on a different sound.
But is it? I mean, because each one, I mean, you have to have a separate signal to each one of the sensors, right? I mean, I understand that the information, the signal's the same, but I mean, this is the struggle for me on this particular issue, because it does seem like each one of those sensors is getting its own signal. Granted, that signal may be the same, but it's still its own signal because it's a separate structure and it has a separate path for that signal to travel. So that's where I'm if you could address that, or I'm just letting you know that's where I'm.
Yeah, Your Honor, I
struggling with.
fully understand your question, and I think it's a bit philosophical. If you have the same 5 volts going down 2 wires in parallel, is that a separate signal or is that the same signal? I would say
Right.
that is the same signal. You're just reading it at 2 different points. That is patent owner's position. I think it read in light of in context of the patent, specifically that we have the independent control, which has to differentiate control. I think we have to allow that independent word to mean something. And if we take just a signal, the same signal going down the wire and being heard by 2 different grad students, I think that's one cue, that's one signal, not a honk and then a different honk.
Would you agree with this statement? While Matsuyama might teach a system that could be used to send a separate independent control signal, that is not what is taught or disclosed or suggested by Matsuyama.
I think that's a reasonable summation of patent owner's
Okay.
position there. And to the extent that an inherency argument were to be derived from that, the fact that there are multiple reasonable interpretations doesn't get you to the requirements under 35.
Right, and I don't think petitioners raised inherency. They can correct me if I'm wrong. I just want to make sure that I wanted to see if you agreed with that statement. Okay.
Correct. Your Honor, just
So then the fight really does focus on, is there sufficient evidence to establish that one skill in the art would in fact use Matsuyama in the way that is claimed? Not whether or not it has the structure or the capability or any of that stuff. Patent owner concedes, look, the device that's disclosed has the ability, it's just nobody has suggested or teaches to operate it in the way in which is claimed.
Your Honor, as it relates to the independent simultaneous data acquisition aspect of it, yes. However,
Yes.
as it relates to the during the frame aspect of it, we have seen no evidence related to a control that is done during the period of time that the image is being acquired, that we are changing any of the collection parameters, such as the aperture, the integration time, the exposure values that we were talking about. In the reference.
Yeah, I think they're somewhat interrelated though, right? Because it seems as though, to me, that's the rub, right? I don't know that patent owner, I don't understand patent owner to be disputing that it could do that. But what's not disclosed is each aperture being controlled independently as its own entity. Sure, maybe that's something somebody could have done if they had thought of it, but patent owner's position is nobody thought of it, nobody's taught it. that's where the innovation lies, or the distinction lies between the prior art, Matsuyama in particular, and what's claimed.
I think that's true, Your Honor, as it relates to Claim 1. I think Claim 22, the during a frame element, is still important. Is that in the reference, you set the value, you then take the picture. You then set the value and take the picture. There is nothing in the reference that says while you're taking the picture, you start changing the values while you're taking the picture. It's sequential.
Okay.
And the during a frame has to mean something, because if you delete that phrase out, you would get to exactly the discussion we were having.
Well, right. I mean, if you take it out, you haven't limited when you're looking at the data acquisition.
Controlling the data acquisition, Your Honor, not just looking.
Or
controlling.
when you're controlling the data acquisition, right?
Yeah, yes, Your Honor, and that control word is important. And it was in one of patent petitioner's demonstratives as it relates to Figure 5 of the patent. So I think it's actually something that's important to talk about here, is that very distinction. If you give me 1 second to bring back up petitioner's demonstratives. Great. I apologize. Oh no. I apologize. I can't seem to put my finger on it, but if we look at Figure 5 of the patent, Exhibit 10001, specifically it says near instantly acquiring the two images. I think that's an important thing for us to talk about, is that there's a difference between capturing the image and controlling the acquisition of the photons that we talked about. So in Figure 5, it says that the images are near simultaneously acquired. That's different than controlling the parameters that we specifically just talked about with regard to opening the bucket, accumulating the amount of rain that has fallen during that time period. I also want to touch on the sort of the motivation to combine as it relates to Matsushima and Yu, and this idea of integration time. If we look at what Matsushima says in the abstract, is sort of on slide 29 of patent owner's demonstratives. It specifically identifies the problem that Matsushima is trying to solve. It's to provide a digital camera that can prevent unnatural boundary regions even when a telephoto image is combined in the center of a wide captured image, and that can obtain images at various magnifications using a simple configuration. On the right-hand side of the slides, Your Honor, we see examples of this unnatural boundary, specifically the unnatural boundary coming when the left-hand side of the image is acquired with one set of collection parameters, and on the right side we have that's the other part of the image that is collected with a different set of collection parameters, be it the aperture, be it the integration time, and we see that we get this really unnatural boundary. So why in Matsushima would we have a circumstance when we're going to give the capability for the integration times to be different, which results in this unnatural boundary, which does not occur if the collection parameters are the same? Why would you do it when the whole goal is to avoid this? And if you have different collection parameters on the left and different collection parameters on the right, it doesn't get you there. Your Honors, I want to touch on ground 3, just very briefly, as I say, I have roughly a minute of time remaining. As it relates to the support in the provisional, whether or not labelets is prior art, I believe we lay that out very well in our papers. However, Mr. Bowser said one thing that is completely inaccurate. Our ground 3 analysis is not entirely predicated on labelets being not a valid prior art reference, which it's not. The proposed combination fundamentally does not have the idea of making any adjustments during a frame. In the U reference, you acquire an image, you generate histograms, specifically use the black and white sensor to generate a histogram, and then you use that accumulated data, those histograms, to make modifications to the various color channels in a subsequent time period. That subsequent time period, when you acquire the next image, is a new frame. It's a different frame. Our claim is very specific in Claim 22, and we call this out in our papers. This is not a new argument. We've been arguing it from day one. Is ground 3, even if you don't get support our arguments related to labelets being a prior art reference and those arguments, it still does not teach the during a frame limitation that we fundamentally have to change one of the parameters related to the accumulation, the collection of the rain, while we're getting the picture. And that isn't there in the combination in ground 3. It's not there in the combination in ground 1.
So on ground 3, so when you're hanging your hat on during, which is not in claim 1, so you're saying that would just relate to claim 22, not
Well,
claim 1?
Your Honor,
argument you just made?
specifically, ground 3 is only related to claims 22 through 28,
Okay.
22, 23, 28, 30, 33. Patent owner has
Okay.
not alleged anything related to the proposed combination under ground 1. So I don't think any inference can be drawn from any statements. We didn't respond to something that wasn't before the court. So just to sum up very briefly, I see that I'm into my my time here. So there are multiple grounds here, and there's multiple deficiencies with the petitioner's petition, and we have to be grounded in what the petition said. So under ground 1, is there simultaneous acquisition when the reference clearly says sequential? As it relates to claim 22, does any of the proposed combinations, does it show that we're going to change any of the acquisition parameters, aperture, integration time, exposure, during the period while we're capturing it? Does Matsushima teach independent control? Independent has to have some meaning, as Judge Laney and I had quite a lengthy conversation about. Now, why? And then, assuming we get all these things, is why on earth would a person of ordinary skill in the art look to combine these references to solve that would create a problem when you combine them, having different integration times on the left side and the right side, that generates this bad boundary when Matsushima's express purpose is to not have that boundary. And then finally, as it relates to the labelets reference, we do submit that the provisional supports it, but it's really not, it's moot because the proposed combination still doesn't even teach during the frame. Without any further questions from the board, I will reserve the remainder of my time. I see I have about 17 minutes left. Thank you.
Your Honors, the reason we're talking about the frame is to determine if Matsushima teaches independent control during the frame. And Matsushima teaches during independent control.
Can we turn on the microphone? I can't, is it?
Sorry. Okay.
Perfect.
All right, thank you. Your Honors, the reason we're talking about during a frame is to determine if Matsushima teaches independent control during a frame. And Matsushima does teach independent control during both the exposure interval and the readout process. We can look on slide 29. Slide 29 is very clear that the sensors 18, again, is CCD 18A and CCD 18B, they are each controlled by shutter gate pulses. Okay, the shutter gate pulses, that's the control happening during the exposure period. Because during that exposure period, you have to tell the sensors how long to acquire the photons. This is during the exposure interval. It's very clear in paragraph 24 that it says the CCDs have a so-called electronic shutter function that controls the accumulation time. Again, we're talking about integration time, how much charge is accumulated by each sensor. Each sensor is independently controlled. I want to also kind of clarify something about
What does independently controlled mean to you in the context of the patent issue?
Okay, so the concept of the patent
Does it require? I guess let me pose it a little bit different. Does independent control require you to be able to control one differently than you're controlling the other?
Yes, Your Honor, and I would direct you for this argument or to this concept here to paragraphs 19 and 20 of our, I'm sorry, pages 19 and 20 of our reply, and we showed that, and I just want to clarify something about the fact that Patent Owners Council said that there's only one common signal, and that's just not the case because, and we know that. Let me look to. Let me find a drawing that kind of helps show this. This is on.
While you're looking for that, just think about this question: does petitioner contend that the accumulation time that Matsushima discloses or suggests you being able to individually set that for the different sensors, and that can be individually set to different integration times?
Yes, Your Honor, and pages 19 and 20 of our reply explain this. And the reason why you have different integration times is because you have different exposure times. Look at the different images. When you have different exposure, when you have different exposures and different subject luminances, you have different integration times. You are controlling each sensor independently, right? We're not telling each sensor to take the same image. We know that from Matsushima. They're taking different images. And so you're independently controlling the acquisition of the photons in each sensor. And that's in paragraph 24. Again, so the important point to keep in mind, patent owner is taking a very narrow interpretation of this common exposure time as if the imaging system in red and the imaging system in blue get the same signal. That's not supported by Matsushima, because when you have different fields of view and you have different subject luminance, then you have different integration times. And when you have different integration times, you have different control. And let me look again on slide 29. It says very clearly that the shutters, there's a shutter function that controls the accumulation time of each sensor. We're not talking about one shutter control signal for both sensors. We're talking about controlling each sensor differently. And I want to point out too, just to reiterate this on slide 30, Your Honors. So there's 2 points here. Number one, IV has contended that this is some sort of made-up theory by the expert. If you go back and look at Mr. Gudash's declaration, paragraphs 25 to 58, I'm sorry, 55, or 53, 24 to 52, where this original diagram is, every single paragraph in that declaration is supported by evidence, every single paragraph. In paragraph 53, Mr. Gudash just explained in layman's terms how sensors are controlled for the integration and accumulation time. You know, IV's counsel made a big deal about how that, unsupported expert testimony is not entitled to any weight. Well, that's just simply not supported by the record. If you go back, you look, and Mr. Gudash, every explanation is supported by evidence. I want to point out too, just to make abundantly clear here, even under IV's construction, when you have during a frame and data acquisition limited to just the exposure interval, look at the exposure interval. That's section 2. That is the integration interval, or integration time, excuse me. You have independent control of the sensors. You are collecting, you're telling the sensor, collect photons. And then you're also telling the sensor to transfer, at the end of the collection period, transfer those photons. Sorry, not photons. Transfer those electrons so they can be turned into an image frame. Mm-hmm.
Can you address their point about the sequentially versus simultaneously?
Yes, I will.
I'm sorry, I didn't turn on my microphone. I'm going to ask my question first. Going back to slide 29.
Okay.
I recall patent owner was making an argument that, so this is probably interrelated with their argument about during a frame, but the independent control, you have highlighted in this figure on slide 29, the CDS and the analog to digital. Doesn't that go back to the argument about the reading out, that so this figure would seem to show that it's also controlling the reading out? Are you relying on the reading out of the data from the sensors for the independent control?
Well, Your Honor, just to be clear, paragraph 24 says the CCDs. Those are the sensors. The sensors are what is acquiring the electron charge.
Okay, I guess I'm just trying to figure out why you have highlighted the CDS and the analog to digital converter in the figure that's on slide 29.
Oh, so that is just showing the different imaging systems. We're just trying to make it clear that you have the imaging system, the first imaging system in red and the second imaging system in green. And those are independently controlled. We're controlling the sensors, again, via the shutter gate pulses. And effectively what those signals are, those control signals, and there are independent control signals for each sensor. And because, again, you're taking different images. Those different images have different subject luminance. And those different images have different exposures. So you necessarily have to have a different control. Let me address quickly.
Before you do that, before you leave this figure, can you explain what 28 is and how it works? The purple, the TG.
Oh, okay.
Separate from 30.
The timing generator, that is sending the signal to keep everything working synchronously. Okay, at the same time. Just making sure, because let's look at, sorry, what slide do I have that on? Slide 19, Your Honors. So let's look at what paragraph 27 says. Each circuit, so we're talking about the imaging, the circuits in the first imaging system in red, and we're talking about the imaging systems in green. Those are driven synchronously. So the timing signal is what's sending this. But we see separate control paths. There's a separate control path that goes to the CCD drive circuit. Again, the 20A, which is what's driving the sensor 18A. Same thing with the sensor 18B is being separately controlled. So if I can quickly touch on the sequential point. Now, this is a case where IV has completely interpreted this just out of context. All right, this concept about sequentially output. Let me go back, and I'm sorry if you could see here. Let me just for context here. Let me go to slide 2. This is what we're talking about. After being exposed to light for certain periods of time, the pixels are read out on a sequential line-by-line basis. We are talking about the sequential line readout period, okay? Let me go back to paragraph 23 of Matsushima. It's almost like they did a word search and found the word sequentially and said, oh, well, that just means that we're sequentially outputting these. That's just not the case, because you are obtaining the same, the two images of the same scene at the same time. I want to briefly touch on too about Matsushima and you, and why IV saying that that can't be combined. This is a fiction that IV created. They relied on this reference, this other reference that said that there's difficulties creating when you have different exposure times, and that you're going to have this, imaging problem. Well, Matsushima alone solves this. Matsushima explains that when you combine these two images, and again, we have different exposures with Matsushima, it uses this combination technique where you are removing the boundaries. You have correction data. So this fiction that they're creating is incorrect. And the last point I want to raise is also about how IV's counsel said that the combination doesn't result in it because U doesn't teach during a frame. So IV is arguing against a combination that just simply wasn't presented in the petition. So what I have on the left is what's in Choi. So this is the modification of Choi. But what I've highlighted is the during a frame aspects. The mapping there all refers to Choi. IV's arguments are not about Choi. IV's arguments are about you. They're arguing about a combination that is not presented in the petition. And I feel like I'm over my time. Can I answer any questions for your honors?
I don't believe there's any questions. Thank you, counsel.
Your Honors, I intend to be rather brief with my rebuttal here, because I think we've crystallized a great deal what the dispute is about. I'm showing currently on the screen paragraph 53 of Exhibit 1003. Your Honors, there's no citation. It says, let me just read the paragraph completely. When a photodiode is disabled from collecting light, photoelectronics are still created from incident light, but they are continuously drained from the photodiode to a power supply in connection in the pixel. Such periods do not affect the imaging result and are not considered part of the integration exposure shutter period. This is shown in the figure that I've created below. There's no citation, Your Honor. And we can look at the paragraphs that precede it. They do not relate to this overlapping time period. I believe counsel said between 50 and 54. They don't relate to that overlapping time period, which is specifically critical to the excerpt that appears in later on related to that timing diagram in the bottom, Your Honors. There's no citation for that. Now I just wanted to turn briefly to petitioner's slide 29. Give me 1 second to get there. There we go. Your Honors had asked about the timing generation 28. We're actually in agreement with what Mr. Bowser said as related to what TG 28 is. That is where the clock is generated. It's no different than any crystal system that is in any digital system. You need to have a clock that allows things to operate, that allows for the synchronization. But as we said before, The fact that things are synchronized does not mean they occur simultaneously. I also wanted to touch on the allegation that we're making a false argument here, and that in Matsushima, you have different integration times, Your Honors. We maintain that the way Matsushima solves the issue of the boundary problem is you use the same EV value. It's the same, so you don't have the boundary. That's why it's not there.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, Your Honor.
And when you're doing that also, I'm just looking at figure 21, because it does look like in Matsushima that you have one sensor that's focused on a different scene than the other one. 62A is different than 62B. One's more focused, the other one's wider. So it does seem to suggest that you are having separate controls, separate integration times, that you are, these sensors are being independently controlled. And I just want you to, I'm explaining what I think this supports, and I want you to explain to me why you do not agree.
Yes, Your Honor, because they are fundamentally imaging the same scene. There's no dispute that Matsushima in the center has a telephoto lens, in the wide it has a wider angle lens, not really a point that's in much dispute. The illumination is going to be the same across the two because it is the same scene. And we're going to make them look the same to avoid the boundary issue by setting our exposure values to be the same, such that you don't have the boundary.
And this exposure value is the EV you referenced earlier.
Yes, Your Honor.
Right? But
Finally,
wouldn't the one that the focal points for example, 62A, because you have the sun there, and in the view, and then 62B, you're more focused on the person, you won't have as much of that light sun energy coming in. Wouldn't that necessarily suggest you're controlling the sensors to accumulate differently?
To accomplish the same EV value, Your Honor, that's what's the critical value here is they're getting one command. It's the one EV value that is being set globally. It is not an EV value that's being set and controlled independently. I did want to just address the slide that I could not conjure during my case in chief, which is slide 51 of petitioner's demonstratives. There we go. Specifically box 508. I'll read the box in its entirety. So this is excerpted from our patent at figure 5. Capturing the image using the second camera channel, wherein the image of the second camera channel has a second field of view and is captured approximately simultaneously with the image of the first camera channel. There's no inconsistency, Your Honor, in what we are maintaining. The claim is not about the image. It's about the collection of the data that ultimately will be combined to form the image. There's no inconsistency with regard to figure 5 or its or its corresponding description in figure 5. Fundamentally, what we have here in both claim 21 and 22 is we have to control the acquisition of the data, the rain filling the bucket. The claim is not speaking to what happens after the bucket is acquired, once a grad student has collected it, how they spin up and test the water. That's not in the claim. The claim is specifically about how long we let the bucket be open and how we control, do we send a grad student out there or do we cover it with a cover? That's what the claim is about. And claim 22 adds this idea that we're going to have grad students running in and out of the field while we're during our data collection period. We're going to have constantly grad students running in and out during that 1 hour that we are collecting the data. That's specifically in 22, and that captures the during a frame concept, which both patent owner and petitioner agree is the time period when the image is acquired. And
Does patent owner believe approximately simultaneously is different than simultaneous?
it is patent owner's position that the specification does make a contrast between simultaneous and near simultaneous. Yes, Your Honor. We would maintain that simultaneous specifically requires both things to be happening at the same time. In the other related IPR on the 158, we had a great example of what near simultaneously was, and this was discussed in the deposition, was the Miyazaki reference. In the Miyazaki reference, the pictures were taken in very quick succession. That would be an example of near simultaneously. There was fractions of a second difference between frame 1 and frame 2, as taught in Miyazaki and discussed in the expert declaration and specifically in his deposition. That would be an example of near simultaneously. They're really close in time, but there is no overlapping period. It is patent owner's position that simultaneously means at the same time. Brandon is moving both of his hands at the same time. If Brandon moves his right hand and then moves his left hand, that is not simultaneously. And without that, does the board have any further questions?
Doesn't look like there's any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bowser,
All right, thank you, Council, for your presentations today. We'll be adjourned and we'll go off record. We will resume our second hearing at approximately 1 o'clock Eastern time.